Wade in the water. Wade in the water, children. Wade in the water. God's going to trouble the water. You may be seated. What shocked me the most was how unholy a place it seemed. I mean, you would think, given its prominence in the Gospels, when all they declare took place there, that it would have been different, that it would have been serene and beautiful, tranquil, pastoral. But it just wasn't that nice. In fact, it probably was about the least nice place I've ever been to in my life. It was desolate, basically just some hot, barren desert, wild wilderness is right. To get there, we had to drive and then walk through landmines. Literally landmines on each side of the path. And yet still, we were going to the Jordan River. The Jordan, the place where all four Gospels say this pivotal, monumental, crucial event in Jesus' life and ministry took place. The baptism of Jesus of Nazareth in the River Jordan. But the place just wasn't that nice. In fact, my first thought on seeing it was, I walked through landmines for this. It was a mud hole with a current. Muddy river in the desert separating two hostile countries. Israel and Jordan, stalemated in perpetual Cold War. It just wasn't that nice. Not near nice enough for the Son of God. Not near nice enough for Jesus. Surely not the place that anyone would pick to have a picture-perfect baptism. Now the Galilee up north where Jesus was from, that was nice. It looked just like you think it should. But this place down south, desert, wilderness, thorns, blistering heat, landmines, strife, war. It just wasn't what you think of when you hear the word baptism. I mean, you hear the word baptism and you think flowing white gowns and cooing babies, family pictures. But none of that was there at that muddy river. Now, see, the problem was, in my mind, I was determined that it should look exactly like it looks in Christian art. The sparkling, clear water portrayed in stained glass, in icons where all the players wear a halo. But facts are stubborn things, and that's just not how it was, this place where Jesus was baptized by John. And yet maybe that makes that baptism all the more exceptional. Exceptional that it took place there. I mean, do we really need the good things of the world only taking place in lovely, beautiful, pristine corners of the world? Or maybe to put it another way, if God were going to come into this world, come to save us in this world. And I mean this world as it really is, not just as we wish to God it would be. Well, then wouldn't that muddy sort of a place be exactly the sort of place where we would need God to come? To the places that are torn apart by war and division. To the places that are not picture perfect and yet are real. For make no mistake, there are landmines in this world. There are landmines in human life. And therefore, if God were really ever going to touch and change that reality around here and in here, well, then I guess he'd just have to step out of the temples and the cathedrals and the artwork and the icons every now and again to do so. And so Jesus went out to John the Baptist, went to that wild, deserted wasteland to that war-torn corner of the world and entered into those muddy waters. Now you have to understand what John the Baptist was up to out there. In that wild, untamed, foreboding place, he picked that location with precise intentionality. Geography very much matters here, because geography is exactly why he went out there to be in that in-between place, that river that served as a demarcation line between Promised Land on one side of it and Nowheresville on the other. For it was out there in the Nowheresville side where the law was given to his Jewish ancestors. It was out there that his people had wandered around for 40 years after the Exodus, only to finally find their way home in that exact same place. It was out there where his people were formed as a people, as God's people, where God was known, and you didn't just practice faith out of family tradition, but out of passion and necessity. Out there in the middle of nowhere, where you knew that God was all that you had. Out there. Because out there, if God did not act in that wilderness for his people could not be. Out there, if God did not turn the mud holes of this world into passageways to the Promised Land, well, then homelessness is all there could ever be out there. And so John, remembering all that, set up shop out there, where there was nothing but hope. Hope in the promise of a God who comes to those who are desperate for the God who comes. The God who turns our mud holes, even those, into passageways to promise, even out there. And so who is it that listened to all that? Who are those people who came out there? Surely not the in crowd, not the elites, not the religious folks who've always got it right, not the beautiful people. No, it was straight out outcast. Those who had been rejected by the religious establishment, the unholy, those who knew that if they ever had a chance, they blew it a long time ago. The desperate, that's who came. Those who said, yes, John sounds a bit crazy. He eats bugs and wears coyote underwear. But by God, he says, even someone like me has hope. That's who came. People whose lives and souls were pretty much like that place. Barren and thorn-ridden and war-torn and desperate for even a moving mud hole of a river to quench the overwhelming dryness that pervades. That's who came. Well, them and Jesus, because Jesus came too. Jesus came and became one with them out there. Which, by the way, was the point of his coming all along, to make the mud hole that had become too much of humanity into a passageway to the Promised Land. That's why he came. Never to people so full of themselves they couldn't imagine needing a Savior. No, it was to people out there on the fringe whose lives resemble mud holes sometimes more than crystal fountains. That's who needs saving, and so that's who Jesus came to save, even out there. I lived all of my childhood and served a good portion of my ministry in the Deep South. And in those parts, there were always a lot of fundamentalists roaming about. They're all over the place. And it seemed like almost like any service, there would be 2 or 3 of them. I don't know what they were doing there. I don't know if they were a family spying on me. I have no clue. And they're great people, but I'll tell you, they are not big on baptizing babies. They don't like the baptizing babies things, and they're exceptionally quick to tell you about it. Why would you baptize a baby? Baby can't read the story of the Bible. A baby can't obey the 10 Commandments. A baby can't say the sinner's prayer. Why are you baptizing babies? I mean, the only way that baptizing a baby could make any sense is if there was a God out there who acts on behalf of those who can't act on their own. Yeah, that's what baptism is. I mean, baptism, at least any baptism that isn't us just throwing water around, demands a divine intrusion into our lives that we can never give ourselves. Every single person in this room requires a voice from heaven, a dove, an intrusion again, that we just can't manifest on our own. So baptize babies and children. Why wouldn't we? Because they're the best of all of us when it comes to admitting need. And we have need. And thus we need an intrusion. Without a divine intrusion, the Jordan's just a mud hole. And Jesus and John are 2 peasants throwing dirty water around. And yet, if God really is the chief actor in all of this, well, then that water can become so much more. I used to have a friend in the priesthood in Kansas City who also went to the Jordan River some years ago, and like me, he was shocked that it wasn't clear and pretty water like in the pictures and stained glass windows, and was shocked that it was dirty and muddy, just like I said, and he thought, Jesus got into that dirty old stream. Now, this priest was way older than I. He grew up in a different time. He grew up with 5 brothers, and when he was little, his mom would bathe he and his brothers every Saturday night in the backyard, one after the other in the same tub, sharing the same bath water. One after the other, after the other, after the other, dirty boys being dipped into increasingly dirty water. Now, my friend, being the youngest, went last, which was a terrible time to go. He hated being last because that meant he was dipped in all of his brother's dirty, nasty, muddy water. And he said when he went to the Jordan River and saw that water, what came to his mind was it looked just like his childhood dirty bath water. Like the dirty bathtub water he and his brothers dirtied up. And I guess it was then that he got it. It was then that he really understood that that's precisely what the coming of Jesus is all about. All of this stuff is not about some pretty picture in an idyllic setting. No, it's about Jesus getting even in the water that we've dirtied up. His daring to get involved even in our dirt. Him entering the mud-hole places of this world and our lives, thereby giving us what we could never give ourselves. And now, because he did that, every dirty mud hole of a river, every dirty mud hole of a person is a place where God can act. That is the miracle of God in Jesus. That God comes to us sometimes despite us. God enters into the waters of our lives and gives us what we could never give ourselves. And the great news is that gets to happen here. And not in some pristine never land, but here with us, not as we should be, but as we actually are. And thus we gather today and we ask, where is it that God is to act? And the answer is always everywhere. In every one, in every time, no matter what. And by the way, that's why today, in just a moment, we're not just going to be throwing water around. Amen.